the way this will work is that David will open up with some initial remarks, and then Nikhil will follow from that. Because of various sensitivities and so forth, we're going to have the remarks on the record, filmed for everyone to follow, to watch later, should they want to. And then the Q&A, which will follow from the opening remarks, will be off the record. So that's where we take our gloves off, basically. This coincides with the publication of a piece that David has written for Open Europe, entitled Gearing Up for Delivery, How to Manage the Renegotiation. So although we're discussing today generally how to negotiate in Europe, no matter who's in government following May's election, David's essay, I think, has a specific focus on what might happen if one of the two candidates will be elected in May, and that of course is David Cameron. But what I want to stress is that the way we look at this at Open Europe is that no matter who's in government after May, Europe will not go away. There will be plenty of complex negotiations and complex situations that have to be solved in Europe. So any prime minister will need to be prepared to negotiate with Europe on a range of different issues. So this discussion today, I think, has relevance no matter who's in power in a few months' time. So, David.
Thanks a lot, Mats. Thank you to Open Europe for publishing my essay and for facilitating today. Looking forward to the discussion. As Matt said, I left government a year or two ago, but I still do have a day job outside it. So what I'm about to say, I should say I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and don't interpret that as the views of the Scotch Whisky Association or any of our august members. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then I think Nikhil will react, and then we'll open for discussion. Before I get into sort of setting out what's in my essay, which is only just published, so I know most of you won't have had a chance to look at it. Before I get into that, I guess I want to begin by addressing a kind of prior question, which is whether it's sort of irrelevant to focus so much on the British problem, if you like, in Europe. With IS rampant in the Middle East and Putin out there on the borders and our homegrown Islamist terrorist problem and so on and so forth. Are we just being self-indulgent in worrying about how we'd come out best from a renegotiation in Europe, which after all might never happen? And when I think of this, I'm reminded of an anecdote in one of George Orwell's essays from 1940, and he describes, he says, early in the war, I'm quoting now, the New Yorker had a picture of a little man approaching a news stall littered with paper, and on the newspapers are headlines like "Great Tank Battles in Northern France," "Huge Dogfights Over the Channel," and so on. And the little man's going to the newsagent and saying, "Can I have a copy of Action Stories, please?" And I'm wondering whether our discussion of the renegotiation is the equivalent of worrying about action stories when there's a lot of kind of real stuff going on out there. And I think certainly when you talk to the foreign policy establishment in the UK and beyond, you get some of that feeling, that these are the important questions. Let's not worry too much about the internal housekeeping. And it won't surprise you to think I don't think that's right. I think solving the British problem is vital to making Europe more effective in all these other areas too. And for two reasons. One, until we feel really comfortable in the EU, we're always going to find it hard to get behind collective European efforts. And I think you can see some of that in the last few weeks, much commented upon. And I think, secondly, our problem, if you like, seems so all-encompassing to us because we don't know whether it's ever going to be solved or not. Will we ever get a status in the EU that works for us? Can we find a status that sort of gels with British public opinion in a durable way? And it feels as if we're constantly faced with a sort of binary choice. Accept the system basically as it is, or off you go. And I think we have to be more sophisticated than that. We have to try and resolve our difficulties, and so do our partners. And I'll come to that at the end. So it means that wherever we pitch our asks, if we do come to a renegotiation, we do need to maximise our chances of success if we're going to get to that status. And that's sort of slightly long-winded way of saying why I was so keen to write this essay, because it does seem to me vital we give ourselves the best chance of success. And as Matt said, I've worked off and on in the British EU machinery for 20, 25 years now. And I guess, or at least I hope, sometimes the distance I now have gives you a perspective that people in the system don't necessarily have as they operate it day to day. So my essay is really about how we get there. It isn't about what we should be asking for, which is a debate that is going on and to some extent still needs to be had. And it's on the assumption, as Matt said, that we are going to be conducting a renegotiation after the election. That is a question, of course, and depends on the election result. But I think that's the assumption I'm working on. Now, I guess I'm not going to sort of take you through paragraph by paragraph the essay, but I think there are three main themes to it that I want to highlight. First of all, making what you want seem normal. How do you shape the context of this negotiation? Second, my proposition is that the current EU mechanisms have evolved rather than being designed, and they aren't best suited to delivering this kind of renegotiation. And third, to address the question of whether we've got our skills in the right place, the right resources and so on going at the renegotiation. So I'll just run through these in order. First of all, making what you want seem normal. Success in negotiating in the EU, in my view, is very much about doing that. The EU is a machine for finding deals and compromises, and in my view, the longer you spend putting your case out there, talking about it, explaining it, eventually it kind of drops into conventional wisdom amongst bureaucrats, amongst diplomats, amongst commentators. And it kind of gradually becomes easier for others to contemplate accommodating. And I think what the UK has done over the last few years on free movement, whether you agree with it or not, is a good example of how, by constantly talking about something, you can actually move the debate along, get it into the system, get people talking about it, and enlarge the range of policy responses. I think the kind of counterexample is the fiscal compact, where we did very little to prepare the ground and got into difficulties at the European Council in 2011. So I think this kind of making what you want seem normal is really important, making it seem part of the kind of ongoing debate about Europe, not some sort of weird opinion out there that doesn't have to be factored in. And I think actually so far the government's not been that bad at getting our ideas out there, maybe a bit more with governments than with commentators and others. But it's done it around a set of negotiating aims that probably most people aren't going to regard as amazingly ambitious, particularly since they've shied away, rightly in my view, from big reforms to free movement. But it is going to have to do more of that if it's going to succeed. And of course, it's a political judgment as to whether what it's currently asking for is going to be enough to secure political support and to win a referendum on the back of it. And it's certainly possible they could be pushed into asking for something more ambitious, either by their own supporters, public opinion, or the logic of events, greater integration much more quickly than is expected in the Eurozone, for example. So we might yet, I guess, end up asking for a much more comprehensive set of opt-outs, more semi-detached status within the treaties, and so on. And if that were to happen, I think we would need to go up another gear in advocating, explaining. We'd really need to spend a lot more time than we're doing at the moment setting out the case, not just to other governments, but to public opinion, to commentators across Europe, and to parliamentary and public opinion too. So I think we've begun the right direction. It's around a set of aims that are, probably many would regard as not amazingly ambitious in the reform direction, but there's a huge more to do. And I think that's where I get to my second point, and it's that our current system isn't really designed for a sort of context-shaping negotiation like this one. The current EU mechanisms, the bureaucratic mechanisms within HMG, have kind of evolved rather than being designed, and they're not capable of setting out a major negotiation, of delivering a major negotiation. The details set out in the essay, but basically what I'm arguing is that our internal system has evolved over the years from a rather decentralised to quite a centralised system, and it's quite good now at putting negotiating power into the hands of a small number of people at the centre of our system, and it maximises their ability to do relatively untransparent deals and negotiations. I think what it's less good at is mobilising the system and broadcasting negotiating objectives, pressing them, winning the arguments. It makes it much more difficult to motivate your own supporters, therefore, or to kind of argue and have the discussion with people outside our own government. So I think the system as we have it isn't geared up for a kind of ground-changing negotiation. The more we are attempting to change the context, to explain our arguments to a wide audience out there across Europe, the more the system will struggle because it isn't geared to delivering that kind of negotiation. Now, I think there is a case for some significant redesign of our European bureaucracy, the way we do things, and we could talk a bit more about that afterwards. But I would certainly say it's not worth plunging into that just as you begin a major renegotiation. So you have to focus on getting clarity and direction within the areas you are planning to renegotiate. And this is what's behind my two sort of major process suggestions in the paper. First of all, that you need a full-time ministerial rank lead negotiator to do this. Needs to have political weight, but also not anything else to do. So there's time to network, reflect, take decisions, explain. Time-limited role, ideally somebody who is not a political threat to others in the government, but somebody who is focused on that. Second, that you need a negotiation unit or team within the system. Now, cross-department units are nothing new, and I used to run one myself, and that's why I say more often than not they just generate extra complexity and blur responsibilities. What you've got to do is for this unit to take with it the key responsibilities for the main bits of the negotiation and be directly responsible for them. So what do I mean in practice? For example, the task in my model, the task of negotiating a satisfactory renegotiation on the question of euro ins and outs ought not to be the responsibility of the Treasury, but it ought to be the responsibility of this renegotiating team and responsible to the lead negotiator. Similarly, the task of developing, say, a red card mechanism for national parliaments, if that's what we do, ought not to be the job of the FCO, it ought to be the role of this unit and negotiator. In other words, you've got to actually detach these responsibilities from the departments that are currently responsible for them, put them in one place in the centre, have a negotiator that's responsible for them to the Prime Minister and capable of taking decisions, doing the trade-offs around them. So you take it out of the world of departmental turf wars, ministerial rivalries and so on, and you generate some clarity and responsibility. Now, people may say that's politically unrealistic, but in a way that sort of illustrates the problem. If we can't set aside the turf wars and the rivalries at this stage, how can we expect them to be set aside during the actual renegotiation under conditions of much greater sort of drama and crisis, perhaps? I think you've got to grasp this nettle at the start, not remodel the whole system, but remodel enough of it at the centre to deliver the kind of renegotiation that's in mind. Third point, and I'll be a bit briefer here, do we have the resources and skills to operate a renegotiation nowadays? I think my answer here is yes, in part. There probably is still enough EU expertise in the UK government system, even though not everyone with the right skills is in the right place, and you might need to shuffle them around a bit. UCREP is still a pretty effective, highly motivated team. But I think it is true that our system has suffered a bit from the reduction in people going to the EU institutions, coming back and forth, and I think the FCO particularly has suffered from the reduction in the number of people who've worked in UCREP over the years, as other departments have kind of taken over that. And I think that matters because what's important is not academic knowledge of the kind that the Commission tests in the concours, but sort of knowing the ropes of how you do it. And there, having been on the ground in Brussels is really the most important thing. So not bad, but we could help ourselves a bit there, I think. Where I do think we might have a problem is in our embassies in EU member states. And this has nothing to do with the people who are working in them, but I think a mixture of kind of cuts and disempowerment over the years has made it a bit harder for them. Many are now incredibly small, heavily reliant on locally engaged staff who, with the best will in the world, are never going to be as motivated in this cause as UK diplomats are likely to be. And if we do go down the road of a more ambitious negotiation, for me there's a bit of a question about, can the embassies pull all the levers? Are they plugged in not just to a small number of officials around the PM, but in their host country, parliamentary, media opinion, opposition, regional players, and so on? And I think that's a test, really, for the next few years. And certainly if there's another round of cuts after the election that bears on the European embassies, I think that will be even more of an issue for us. And I know the FCO has to staff up many different priorities, but I think it does need to take a view, if we're going down this road, of how important this negotiation is and give it some real focus in the staffing and resource decisions it takes. So just to wrap up, to repeat the three propositions, we need to work harder at changing the context. What we want, whatever it is, needs to seem normal in the European debate, not weird. We need to do the necessary to get our internal mechanisms in order without reordering the system completely at this stage. And we need to get the right people in the right places and resource them appropriately. Just one final thought, and this really comes back to my first point about making what you want seem reasonable. And this, as I said, this renegotiation is often seen by others as the, quote, British problem. Why won't those Brits put up with the arrangements that work so well for everyone else? Why are they always wanting to change things and so on? And I think, to some extent, that's a fair point and a fair criticism. I do also think, though, that it's the responsibility of others in Europe, other member states, those who shape opinion, to respond to the change that we are looking for if they want the EU to survive in the long run. And if you look at the analogy of constitutional change in Britain, nobody was saying, for all the trauma the debates have caused in recent years, nobody was saying, or only a tiny minority was saying, constitutional change within the UK was unreasonable. There was nobody saying that those propounding it were doing something illegitimate. And I think that's been one of the strengths of the UK debate on devolution over the last few years. And yet, when we look at our proposals to reform the EU, they're often characterised by others as kind of unreasonable, unfair, self-serving, and so on. And I think there's a gap between the two debates. And I think whatever others in the EU think of British proposals, and we need to make the case and they need to react, I don't think it's right for them to give in to this tendency. Successful political organisations have got the ability to evolve. And those that can't evolve tend to disappear. And the EU has got to be able to change without kind of constant sort of internal psychodrama, bad feeling, and so on. It's got to be more adaptable in that way. And if it's not, it starts to look a bit like, and this is an analogy I use a bit, it looks a bit like the sort of Austro-Hungarian Empire in its final years, kind of obsessed with its internal arrangements and completely unable to deal with the external challenges it faces. And I think Europe can do better than that. And over the next couple of years, we can see whether it will. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. There are chairs up here in the front if you guys at the back want to sit down. And then Nikhil will follow on from this.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. And thanks also, David, for a fascinating essay and introduction. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to read David's essay before it was published this morning, so I have a chance to react. And like David, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, not saying anything that reflects the organisation I'm working for at the moment. I'll try to keep my remarks brief and react to the themes that David set out. I broadly agree with what he is suggesting, though I'd place the emphasis on a few points slightly differently. I think this negotiation, or this renegotiation, if and when it takes place, will be of an entirely different kind and nature to the conventional treaty renegotiations that have happened in the last few decades. The stakes are so much higher, the issues are more complicated and multi-layered. And I think what David said about trying to make sure that whatever the UK asks for is mainstreamed within public opinion across Europe is absolutely important. I think, though, that we in the UK and the UK authorities in particular will probably need to deliver something of a step change in the mindset with which this negotiation is approached. And by they probably need to transform their thinking into a campaign mentality and gear up and resource up to align with that. Because we are talking about a discussion over 2 years in 28 member states, at all levels of those member states, so leadership, political parties, parliaments, civil society, economic actors, corporates, business, and to really be effective and mainstream whatever it is the UK asks, there needs to be influencing going on right across the spectrums in all of those member states and across the European Parliament. And I think that probably militates against a sometimes conventional view of negotiation, that this is something that can be done relatively privately and relatively confidentially amongst 4 or 5 key leaders or key leaders' offices across Europe. I just can't see how a negotiation like this could really play out like that, not least as the way the negotiation is conducted will have a bearing on whatever the outcome of any future referendum in the UK might be, and indeed future referenda in other member states that may need to go through ratification processes. Where the UK in the past has been strong is setting out analytical arguments, detailed, thoughtful, rigorous, academic justifications for its positions, and I think that is a strength, and sometimes the quality of the material produced from the UK is of the highest in Europe. That needs to be complemented more effectively by emotional and I'd say cultural arguments, and I think we need to think very carefully about the language we use. Now, that doesn't mean that we shy away from saying things that are challenging. Indeed, I think it's quite necessary to say things that are challenging, including in specific member states. But it does mean that we need to be, as part of this central campaign thinking, we need to be constantly thinking about what it is we're saying, re-evaluating and calibrating, tempering what we're saying, depending on what we're hearing back. So that would be sort of addressing the first part of what David said. David's second idea was around the internal organisation in Whitehall and the, in particular, appointing a lead minister and a freestanding unit. Here, I think I'd make a couple of alternative suggestions. I think it's absolutely right that there needs to be a very senior level cabinet rank minister leading the negotiation and in charge of this. On the issue of a freestanding unit, I am partly convinced. I think there absolutely has to be within Whitehall a freestanding unit that is coordinating all this and collecting all this information and intelligence that's coming back from a campaign. I find it hard in reality, though, to think about how you could take away the responsibilities of the lead departments. And if the reason for doing that is worries about turf wars between different departments, then the solution is to impose a degree of discipline and coordination and cut those turf wars out. And I think when the UK system does do that, and I can think of the banking union negotiation where we managed to get a new voting system arrived at between ins and outs. In that negotiation, you had real collaboration between Number 10, Cabinet Office, Foreign Office, Treasury, and in that case, the Bank of England, and as was the Financial Services Authority. There was real alignment. Now that perhaps is not as usual as it should be, but I think that level of collaboration is probably what's necessary. And the reason why I think it's going to be quite difficult to remove ministers from their responsibilities or departments from their responsibilities is that the sheer breadth of the campaign that will need to be launched to achieve our aims is going to require everyone, all hands on deck. And many of the debates that are going to take place, for example, the relationship between euro ins and outs, is a debate that plays out in the ECOFIN, the meeting of European finance ministers, where you have the Eurogroup ministers and ministers from non-Eurozone countries talking about specific issues. I imagine that is going to be a major forum for discussing some of these issues. Some of the negotiation that the UK may want to put forward is going to require legislation, which will have to go through sectoral councils. So I can't see that you could completely take away the responsibilities of lead departments. Thirdly, on people, again, agree very much with everything David said. I'd make one additional point, and it links to my first point, and that is, as civil servants, we're very much trained in writing analysis, going to negotiating meetings, preparing papers, and so on and so forth. What civil servants are generally less comfortable doing, with the exception, I guess, of our embassy network, we are less comfortable engaging in a political environment. It's not a party political environment, but a political environment. And that means going out into the European Parliament, meeting MEPs from parties that may not have sister equivalents in the UK, and engaging with them in argument and discussion and making our case. And that's not something that a UK civil servant is traditionally, a UK civil servant particularly based in London is traditionally comfortable with doing. But I think for this renegotiation to be successful, we will need to ensure that our teams are capable of going out and making the case in a very systematic and deep way. And the machinery will need to be sufficiently resilient to allowing civil servants to do so. So in a situation like that, there are bound to be, if you've got hundreds of officials going around across Europe talking about these things, there are bound to be cases where one or two things get misquoted, someone misspeaks, and some of that plays back. And the system in the UK needs to be resilient to deal with that, I think, if we're really going to win the argument, and not clamp down on officialdom in a way that disempowers them from really supporting the objectives of the government of the day. And my final point is, in all of this, we shouldn't forget about the global dimension. So what was really quite interesting about the Scottish referendum was how we would get leaders from the US or Asia commenting on ultimately internal UK constitutional matters. And in our engagement, making sure that our non-EU international partners, so partners in the US, in Asia, in other countries, understand what is going on, I think is important, because these are debates that shape the UK's place in the world, but also Europe's place in the world. And they will be feeding back messages as to what they see and what they understand from what is playing out in Europe. And they'll be feeding those messages back to us in the UK, but also to our European partners. Thanks.
Thank you very much.